Mr. Nick Johnson is the Senior Vice President for State and Fiscal Policy at the Center of Budget and Policy Priorities. He operates out of Washington, D.C., and under his leadership, have been able to establish 43 centers like the one we're going to talk about today throughout the United States. Hawaii will be the 43rd policy center here, and we're very excited about that. You know, over the last 30 days, Tom and I and Linnell have been able to work very closely with Nick in trying to articulate to him some of the unique characteristics about Hawaii, and he's embraced them, and that's been a really good experience for us. It gave us comfort that, you know, he would come in and help us set up the infrastructure for this policy center to be effective. And I hope he talks a little bit about that uniqueness in his comments going forward. So with no further ado, please join me. I want to welcome you folks all to a great day. I want to again thank our leadership, Debbie, for being here. And then finally, I couldn't not recognize my former boss and our senior fellow, Mr. Calvin Taqueta, up here in the front. Calvin, you got to stand, Calvin. Come on. Thank you, Calvin. All right, everybody, please welcome Nick Johnson.
Former Vice President Joe Biden has a thing he likes to say. He says, "Don't tell me your values. Show me your budget, and I'll tell you what you value." I study state budgets because if you value the idea that everyone in America, regardless of where they came from or who their parents are or how much money they have or what neighborhood they grew up in, deserves to have a chance to realize their full potential, to live a healthy and productive life, state budgets have critical and often underappreciated levers for making that value into a reality. Here in Hawaii, you have proven time and time again through your public policy decisions that you take these values to heart. This is, after all, the state with the nation's best track record of providing health insurance to kids. It's the state that's breaking new ground, for example, in moving to renewable energy sources, controlling harmful tobacco consumption, crafting innovative responses to seemingly intractable social problems. Clearly, the nation's 50th state has so much to teach the rest of us. But in the face of that track record of accomplishment and that spirit of innovation, I know many of you in Hawaii, as many of us around the country, are wondering whether we as a nation can continue to make sure our budgets reflect our values. And in fact, budget proposals coming out of the Trump administration and coming out of the leadership in Congress are really calling into question whether federal policy will continue to embrace the value of opportunity for everybody. As Micah said, transformative changes are on the table. These changes would be deep, they'd be structural, and they'd be dangerous. They would undermine relationships that exist among levels of government, civic organizations, and ordinary families that are served by them. And they would threaten economic opportunity for tens of millions of people for generations to come. Now, we don't know yet which, if any, of these proposals are going to be enacted into law, but merely their specter is clearly cause for worry. At the same time, the last 8 months have shown me that we have tremendous reason to be hopeful. And this morning, I'm so happy to have the opportunity to explain why exactly I feel that way. I'm really grateful to Debbie Berger and Micah Kane at the Hawaii Community Foundation for providing all of us this opportunity to come together at this critical juncture for the future of the country. You know, the Community Foundation here is a backbone of Hawaii's civic life, and they have such a profound vision, this idea represented here at this conference that philanthropy can use advocacy and must use advocacy to realize our shared hopes for our children, our families, our communities, and our environment. Calvin Taqueta, of course, has blazed a trail. He's made the community foundation one of the boldest community foundations in the country. And I'm really thrilled that at this critical moment, this momentum will continue under Micah and Debbie's leadership as they pair your collective wisdom with philanthropic passion and energy to improve communities all across this state. And of course, I also have to thank Tom and Chips and Linnell and all the other dedicated staff members of the Hawaii Community Foundation who did such an amazing job putting together this conference. It's a particular honor to be joined by elected officials, including Representative Colleen Hanabusa, Senate President Ron Kochi, and Scott Saiki, Speaker of the House. These leaders really understand what's at stake in these budget battles, and your presence here today shows your commitment to reinforcing America's value of opportunity for all. Most importantly, perhaps, it's having all of you here today in this room from all across the state, from multiple islands, giving me hope in these uncertain times. Here in Hawaii and nationwide, advocates and civic organizations, the philanthropic community, and ordinary citizens are stepping up, recognizing the stakes, and seeking the facts on these policy proposals, and getting involved like never before. Let's think about this Joe Biden quote again for a moment. It's actually a little bit glib, isn't it? I mean, it's easier to say, show me your budget, when you're the vice president of the United States and you've got your own big staff full of policy experts who can decode that budget for you. For most of the rest of us, budgets are written in jargon, in language most of us don't understand. Thousands of pages in which to dig through to try to find that one number that will tell the story you're trying to tell. And politics, of course, too often obscures or distorts the math. At heart, that's why my organization, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, exists. Our main goals are to produce accessible, reliable, nonpartisan information about what budgets really mean for families and communities, and to ensure that information can inform policy debates about the approaches that really will help communities to thrive. I said a minute ago that state budgets can be important levers for advancing economic opportunity. Let me say a word more about why that's true. You know, states and localities are responsible for about half of all domestic public sector spending. Schools, healthcare, human services, transportation. Many of those services are funded from state tax dollars collected right here in Hawaii and in other states around the country. But a significant share are federally funded. So if the federal government steps back from funding its share of these services, states are left with this choice. Either find the funds in an already overstretched state budget to fill in for the gap left by the feds, cut benefits, cut people who are enrolled, cut payments to providers, or let these crucially important services just slip away. It's basically an impossible choice. Of course, this is not the first time that federal cuts have been threatened. The importance of the services that state budgets pay for and the interconnectedness of state and federal policy when it comes to the ability to invest in communities and promote widespread prosperity led us a number of years ago to partner with some national foundations to launch something we call the State Priorities Partnership that Micah referred to a moment ago. Our vision was a network of independent, nonpartisan, deeply rooted state-level policy shops that pull back the curtain on state budgets, illuminate these complicated questions, cut through the jargon, and cut through the politics. And the goal was that nonprofits and funders and policymakers, journalists, and ordinary citizens would have the reliable, real-time information that they need to understand and inform their own state's budget decisions. Today, as Micah said, we're in 42 states plus the District of Columbia, and I'm really thrilled that our newest member is going to be right here in Hawaii. Yay. Thank you. And I'll share more about that new resource in just a few moments. But first, let me circle back to share a few more words about what specifically we're facing in Washington, because I think it's important to understand the exact nature of the challenges ahead. I want to talk about the Medicaid debate. I want to talk about the SNAP program, formerly known as food stamps. I'm going to talk about spending caps that are on the table affecting federal appropriations. I'm going to say a word about taxes. So let's start with Medicaid. Medicaid is the single largest federal grant to states. It funds health care for low-income people, and the dollars support doctors' offices, rural hospitals, urban hospitals, school-based health clinics, nursing homes, and other providers. And the point is to deliver care to a wide range of working families, kids, people with disabilities, and seniors. Medicaid currently funds about health care for 300,000 people here in Hawaii. 35% of them are children. 20% are seniors and people with disabilities. Over the last few years, Hawaii has actually expanded the Medicaid program, as have other states, to provide health care to tens of thousands of people who otherwise mostly would not have access to insurance at all. For the last few years, leaders in Congress have been pushing hard for big structural changes to this program. You may have heard these things called block grants or per capita caps. But don't be fooled by the different names. And really don't be fooled by the cynical promise that these changes would give states more flexibility. Because under the existing Medicaid structure, anyone who's eligible for benefits or services can receive them. And federal funding will increase automatically and immediately respond when economic conditions or health necessities require it. Proposals to block grant or impose these per capita caps would instead give each state a fixed amount of money, regardless of how much help people actually need. That amount would shrink over time. It would become less adequate to meet the healthcare needs of our communities, and it would shift more costs onto state governments. And let me give you an example. Just today, we released our analysis of a bill that has been put forward by Senators Cassidy and Graham. We estimate that because this bill would create both a block grant and a per capita cap to replace big chunks of Medicaid and subsidies, by 2026, Hawaii would lose $619 million a year in federal funds. And the loss would be even greater if Hawaii faced unexpected health or economic challenges, because there would be no automatic adjustment. So that would be $619 million that the state of Hawaii would either have to come up with from some other source or would have to take out of the healthcare program. Meanwhile, there's a similar story on the SNAP program, formerly known as food stamps. As with Medicaid, most of the recipients of this program are kids, seniors, people with disabilities, and most of the rest are working families. 1 in 8 Hawaii residents relies on SNAP to put food on the table. And this is such a critical resource in a state where food costs almost 60% more than on the mainland. Among the tens of thousands of Hawaii working families who rely on this program are 3,000 educators, 5,000 healthcare workers. The Trump administration has proposed to take this program, which is now 100% federal funded, and instead require states to pick up 25% of the tab. In Hawaii, that means over $100 million a year shifted onto the state budget. Then there's the federal government's annual appropriations for non-defense programs. And this is a category of spending that ranges from education to infrastructure, to science, to scientific research, environmental protection. This category of spending includes, for example, housing assistance. Last year, more than 20,000 Hawaii households got help paying the rent. Since 2011, this category of spending, known as non-defense discretionary spending, which really just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? This category of spending has been subject to annual caps that over time have shrunk it smaller and smaller. So even before this administration took office, these caps have been squeezed to historically low levels. Yet both the proposals we've seen this year out of the House of Representatives and in the Trump administration's budget would reduce these caps even further, in part to make way for increased defense spending, down to a level we have not seen since Herbert Hoover was president. And finally, a word about tax policy. Congressional leaders and the administration continue to say that major tax legislation remains among their highest priorities for the rest of 2017. Based on what we've seen so far, such legislation likely will reduce federal revenues to a dramatic extent and deliver most of its benefits to a fairly small number of very wealthy households. One immediate danger coming out of these proposals is that House leaders are proposing to use a procedural mechanism that allows them to fast-track these tax cuts through the House and the Senate only if they enact hundreds of billions of dollars in cuts immediately to programs like Medicaid, SNAP, and the federal earned income tax credit. So we're very concerned not just about the impact of tax changes on the long-term ability of the federal government to fund critical programs, but also on their immediate effect in driving budget choices in Congress. So the mere fact that these ideas are even on the table is disconcerting, to say the least. All of these decisions would have direct and indirect consequences for Hawaii's nonprofit and philanthropic community. Micah alluded to this in his remarks. He said, when challenged about the impacts these proposals would have, you often hear policymakers say, well, don't worry. The nonprofit sector will make up the difference. Philanthropy will make up the difference. But you know that math just doesn't work. The cuts in publicly funded services under discussion would dwarf philanthropic and nonprofit resources by any dimension. It's not that philanthropy and nonprofits wouldn't love to be able to make up for these cuts, but you're already working so hard to do so much for so many people. The marginal resources just aren't really there. But I'm more convinced now than ever before that our voices can be heard on this. The voices of those of us who work in the nonprofit sector and for foundations, and the voices in the communities that we care most about. Think about this. Back in November, the new administration and leaders of Congress promised that there would be a bill to repeal the Affordable Care Act on President Trump's desk by Inauguration Day. Then they said February, then they said May, then July. It hasn't happened. And the reason is that it turns out, even in this fake news era of ours, that facts do still matter. And it's particularly true at the state level and at the community level. Because here's what happened. In the wake of the election, our organization and many others, large and small, old and new, all across the country, working together with health providers and local officials and others, churned out data and information on the tens of millions of Americans whose health coverage was at risk. These data amplified and reinforced the personal narratives of so many people whose lives were directly affected. In Ohio and in New Jersey, for example, 6 Republican congressmen rejected the first House repeal bill, standing up against their own legislative leadership, forced by their constituents to face the facts presented to them by nonprofit advocates and analysts in those states. Their votes, in turn, slowed the progress of the bill at a critical moment, and it exposed the fundamental flaws in the whole repeal and replace mantra. to such an extent that eventually, when it made its way over to the Senate, it died there. Beyond the hope that this federal victory inspires in me, I also see hope at the state level. Facts still matter in state policy battles, too. One great success in this spring's legislative cycle was the adoption of new state-level earned income tax credits, bringing this evidence-based anti-poverty tool to 3 new states, including right here in Hawaii. By boosting the incomes of working poor families, earned income tax credits help these families provide stable homes for their kids, which in turn helps them do better in school and be more successful in life. And so congratulations to all of you in this room, some of you have worked for many years to see this policy enacted into law. Enactment of the EITC, as well as other responsible tax policies here in Hawaii, I think are part of a broader trend at the state level. It's not yet a universal trend, but I think states are starting to get smarter about how we raise revenues and smarter about how we grow our economy in ways that everybody can participate. In particular, I am seeing signs that the myth of the omnipotent tax cut, this idea that our economic challenges can be brushed away if we just cut taxes enough, is starting to be recognized much more widely for the canard that it is. The state of Kansas 5 years ago enacted an enormous tax cut. It was promised that it was going to revitalize the economy. And it made its advocates, its governor, absolute darlings of the political right. Instead, their plan, their proposal, blew a massive hole in the state budget. It led to massive cuts in public education, in human services, services for kids, services for seniors. And far from prospering, the Kansas economy wilted. This spring, a new crop of elected officials, Republicans and Democrats, worked together to reverse that tax cut and restore funding for critical services. An astonishing pushback on what until recently was ideology that seemed like it could not be shaken. So as we head into the 2018 elections on the horizon, where 36 governorships around the country and many legislatures are up, I am so excited by what the impact of this energy and momentum can have at the state level. I believe things are changing. I had the opportunity yesterday to visit your wonderful state capitol for the first time ever. And I know a lot of you are regulars up there as well, helping your representatives understand how their decisions would affect the families and communities where you work day to day. As civic leaders, I'm really excited that you're going to have one more tool in your quiver to make you even more effective spokesmen for your communities. As Gavin and Victor will describe in a moment, the new Hawaii Budget and Policy Center has been established with the help of local funders. They're going to have the support of an amazing advisory board of local leaders and of my organization's team of 30 experts in state policy, communications, and outreach. Like its peers in other states, the new Hawaii Center is intended to serve as a resource for grasstop leaders and grassroots advocates, for philanthropy, for nonprofit organizations, helping everyone to understand what's at stake. The goal here is to make all of you more effective advocates for the things that you know can move the needle in this state. So to share more about this effort, I'm really pleased to introduce Victor Gemignani. He's a longtime advocate. Many of you know him, working to expand prosperity and opportunity for Hawaii families. Victor and his co-director, Gavin Thornton at the Hawaii Appleseed Center for Economic Justice, have done so much great work working with legislators and nonprofit allies and others to lay the groundwork for really important critical public policy advances, from health and safety improvements for public housing tenants to better procedures for educating homeless kids, and of course, the new state Hawaii Earned Income Tax Credit, among many other hugely important victories. This work creates this terrific foundation, I think, for the progress that I think all of you can make going forward in the spite of these difficult times in building brighter futures for everyone here in Hawaii. Victor?
Thank you, Nick. I very much appreciate that. And on behalf of Gavin and myself and our board of directors, I really want to thank the Hawaii Community Foundation for supporting the effort we're going to talk about this morning so heavily and holding a conference like this, giving us enough opportunity to talk a little bit about what our plans are for Hawaii Appleseed. Now, the mission of Hawaii Appleseed is fairly simple. It's working towards a Hawaii where everyone has genuine opportunities to achieve economic security and fulfill their potential. Focus areas are housing, primary focus area are housing, economic justice, and hunger. We also do some work in health and education. That's an area, those two areas are areas we continue to have an interest in, but we have not spent significant amounts of energy over the last 2.5–3 years. Now, one of the problems, economic challenges faced by our residents in our community are fairly simple. We have the highest cost of living in the United States. This graph indicates exactly how high that cost of living is, at least in terms of rents. The green line indicates the escalation of rent values in the state. The blue line indicates the wages. Our wages have remained relatively stagnant, particularly since 2005. If you take a hard look at the growth between and the gap that's been created between wages and housing availability, you get a better sense of the real problems we're confronted with. Lowest wages in the United States, highest costs in the United States, including housing. Housing, we all know we have the highest cost of housing. We have the highest percentage of people that are cost burdened in the state. We have the highest rate of homelessness in the United States. So we're suffering and bleeding really badly because of our shortage of housing and the stagnancy of wages that we've had. The third element within the context of this dilemma that people are confronted with is we have the second highest tax policy in the United States when it's directed at low and moderate income individuals. This graph indicates a little bit about the problem we have in trying to structure a tax system that really is fair to our low and moderate income individuals in the state. We're paying about people that are living in poverty are paying about 13.5 cents out of every dollar in taxes, whereas those at the top level of income in the state are paying about half of that, about 8 cents out of every dollar. And if you take a look at the graph on the first, on the left-hand side, you'll see that 11% of that 13.5% that our low and moderate income residents are paying is on GET. And that's the essence of our problem vis-a-vis the tax policy. Our GET brings in about 45% of all of the income in the state, and it's about the most regressive tax policy you could ultimately implement. So when we talk about adding more and more to GET, it's a direct stab at the ability of low-income, moderate-income people to ultimately support themselves and meet the challenges that they have in their life. One way you can deal with wages, the lowness of wages, is reduce the taxes that people are paying, leave more money in their pockets. That's, in my opinion, the easiest and most efficient way of doing that. This last year, we were able to work, after about 4 years of groundwork, we were able to work with a coalition called Tax Fairness. And Tax Fairness was able to get through, as Nick suggested, a policy through the state legislature that became the 26th state in the United States that has a state-funded EITC program. Now, Earned Income Tax Credit program brings about $250 million into the state from the federal government. The state EITC program will add to that ability of low and moderate income wage earners to ultimately face the problems they have in their stagnant wages. About $135 million because of this effort will go into the pockets of low and moderate income wage earners over the next 5 years. There's a lot of opportunity to continue with the work around economic justice, to be able to get tax policy changed, to ultimately start to change the dynamics of the graph we showed you a little bit before. Wages will start to increase, or at least take-home pay will start to increase. A few other examples of activities we've been involved in include the ADU, the creation of a bill in the City Council allowing homeowners to create accessory dwelling units in their backyards, again, increase the supply of demand, or supply of housing rather, to meet the high demand at a time when government funding is stretched. So local owners of homes that have the ability to invest in their property will be able to build small units in their backyards up to 800 square feet to house themselves, their parts of their AHANA or other taxpayers that are searching for shelter in the state. But by the way, 43% of our people are rentals, not owner occupancy. So we have a heavy emphasis on rentals in the community, primarily because of the cost of our housing. We also have been spearheading some work in child hunger. We are the 47th worst state in the United States in terms of accessing federal dollars, and they're all federal dollars. Justice SNAP is paid up by 100% of the federal dollars. EITC also, school breakfast is also. So we're working with the Department of Education to come up with different designs that allow kids to be able to more effectively access breakfast in the classroom. All good policy starts with a good research, understanding exactly what the issues are and what the models are that exist to be able to change the dynamics. After we do the research that's necessary, we develop reports in the areas that we think are particularly appropriate. We share those reports extensively with the public and the state legislature, city officials, and we get a lot of media attention as best as we can. We had a poll that was done about a year ago with funding from the Center for budget and policy priorities that indicated over half of our people are living paycheck to paycheck. That's an example of the media work we do. And everybody in this room that does advocacy knows how critical the development of sophistication and communication and marketing is to get our message out. We also obviously take that material, those research, those models, and those reports and do advocacy in the legislature. That advocacy always is done in connection with vibrant coalitions. And I've come to the conclusion, old in my life maybe, that the most important effective tool we have in getting policy change, meaningful policy change, is accessing those in the community that share our values and share our visions and form together coalitions that, armed with the data, armed with the research, and armed with the models, can start to make a significant change in development of meaningful policy for the people that we most care about. So that leads us to the Hawaii Budget and Policy Center. We have been in dialogue with the center for the last 2 years, particularly Nick Johnson from the center, to see if we could become the 43rd state budget center in the United States. We are so excited that the Harold Castle Foundation gave us a planning grant to hire the Islander Institute to take a look at the types of issues that were out there that we ought to be taking a look at, taking a look at the members of the coalitions and the coalitions that are existing, other members of the coalitions that we could add to that group, take a look at the formation of an advisory committee, and take a look at some of the activities that ultimately might be most appropriate for some of our initial work. And I can't tell you how thrilled after 2 years finally getting an approval from Nick and the center to join that incredible network. That network will bring not only resources from the center, and they are huge, to be able to allow us to better frame our messages, get the messages out, and frame the debate with coalitions that we have to. But also, ultimately, the 43 other centers that exist around the United States have lots of talent, lots of skills, lots of material we can share, same as the Appleseed network was able to spur on a lot of the non-litigation advocacy we do today. So having gotten that far, I'd like to introduce my co-director, Gavin Thornton. Gavin has been with Hawaii Appleseed now for about 8 years. He served about 4 years in between coming back in Seattle. We were able to entice him back, and he is the best partner I've ever had in my life. It's a real privilege to introduce him. Thank you.
Good morning. It is always so great to be at events like this, where you have such a large group of like-minded people together. I just really want to thank Hawaii Community Foundation for making this happen. Really inspiring, and I'm so excited about what's happening in Hawaii today. So many opportunities, in spite of the nightmares that you read about that are going on the East Coast. If you could bring up the slide. So that's me. So you're getting a sneak peek at the Hawaii Budget and Policy Center. We have not yet launched. This is a prototype logo. I kind of wanted to do a poll to see what you would like, if it's like a Ko'olau Mountain motif with bar graphs. So anyway, sneak peek, that might not be it, but the important thing is this, the mission of the center. The value of the center is that facts matter. As Nick said, facts matter, data matters. That is how we make good policy. And that is what this new center is intended to do, providing reliable research and analysis on tax and budget issues to achieve better policy outcomes. And primarily, that work is focused on reducing poverty and inequity and restoring fiscal responsibility in equitable and effective ways. That is what we're trying to do. And so, as Victor mentioned, this has been a long process to work up this center. And a big part of that process, more recently, has been forming an advisory board, a team of experts to guide and direct the work of this center. So we formed this wonderful advisory board. It includes a business executive, philanthropist, teacher, DOE administrator, UH Board of Regents chair, and that is just one person has done all those things. Randy Moore, for those of you that know him, extraordinary individual, has really led up the effort to recruit an advisory board of a lot of folks like him. We're very excited about the support that the center has already received from people in the community that really care about where Hawaii is going. The other thing that we've been working on, I think Micah might have mentioned that we've fundraised for the center. We have started fundraising for the center. He asked me the other day, so what can we say about it? Like, can we say that it's launched, that it's going to happen? I said I'll rob a bank if I have to make it happen. It is happening. People have been very receptive. And so we believe that the center will launch by the end of the year. We're shooting for the end of the year, next 2 to 3 months. One very important component of that is hiring dedicated staff for the center. So initially, we'll start with a policy analyst, someone that knows a lot about this type of work, doing research on budgets. And then we'll also have initially part-time communication staff. You know, when you start talking about taxes and budgets, people's eyes tend to start glazing over, and we don't want that to happen. But the really key component of this work is making it accessible to people, making it so people understand what the implications are. And you really can't do that if you're boring people to death. So that's another component. And then finally, I want to emphasize this last point. The center, once it is up and running, is intended to be a community resource. So Victor showed earlier this picture. This is the bill signing for the EITC bill. And it is somewhat of a representation of the number of people, number of organizations that were involved in that effort. A massive community effort. You don't make change by nerds like me sitting in a room all day in front of a spreadsheet and crunching numbers. That's not how stuff gets done. It is through the work of many, many people coming together, unifying around an issue. And so I want to emphasize to all of you today that is the purpose of this center. It is for the community. It is for legislators who have a tremendously difficult job being pulled this way and that with limited resources and hundreds of pukas to fill, hundreds of needs to fill in the community. This center is intended to learn from the community about what the needs are out there, to then do the research, analyze the data, and figure out the best approach forward, going forward together as a community. So again, very thankful to be here today, very excited about where we are headed. Really appreciate all your time. And now we're going to have an opportunity to, Nick's going to come back up, respond to some questions about the federal climate. I'll be here as well to talk about the center if you have questions about that. So thanks so much.
So good morning again, everyone. I'm Tom Kelly. On your table, blue, red, or other, are cards. and I apologize if we didn't announce before. We want to get as many questions as possible, because even if we can't answer them in the time we have, we'll be doing conference follow-up after this conference, and so we want to get as much information from you all as possible. Wave it in the air. Staff will be walking around and grabbing it, and so please do that. And for the rest of the day, you're going to find these cards everywhere you look. Same thing. The panel with our legislators, the afternoon panel, the lunch as well. So look for the cards, look for staff, get them to the front, and we're going to organize them and get to as many as possible. So as you're doing that, I am going to thank you both again for being here and doing this morning. We're excited to have not only the visits of Nick and Lee from the center, but working this past few days and the next few days around how we think about our Hawaii Center. So I'm going to actually ask the first question to Gavin, because we actually had this question yesterday as well, and that is, there's so many issues, where do you start? So how are you going to prioritize what the center starts to study?
Yeah, that is a great question, a very difficult question. So here's what we're looking at initially. For the initial project, we are thinking about doing a budget primer, basically just an overview of taxation and the state budget, trying to really understand what all the pieces are. Where's our income coming from? What are we spending it on? What have the trends been over the years? We feel like that would be a helpful initial start to inform the community, help bring people up to speed, also helpful at the legislature. But really, even for the initial project and future projects, we want input from the community. We have our advisory board that we have tried to make a diverse group of folks. We will continue to work on adding members to that board and increasing the diversity, getting their expert input, getting input from legislators, and then getting input from folks that are doing the work on the ground.
Great, thank you. This is, I'm going to continue with Gavin for the moment, because I'm getting a lot of questions about Hawaii Center, and then I do have some questions for Nick as well. The questions come up of, how do you stay nonpartisan? This is a small place. Independence, nonpartisan analysis, how do we address that?
I mean, it's all about the facts, right? Again, third time, facts matter. And you can't, I don't believe in alternative facts. So that is the strength of the SPP network and the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. It is all rooted in indisputable, unassailable fact and data. Now, when you apply those facts, you may come to different conclusions, and that's fine. But for us, we think it's very important to be reliable, to be credible, and transparent in the analysis that we do. So that's the main focus.
Great, thank you. Nick, I've got a difficult but interesting one from the floor. Policy is made over time and layered over time and gets both complex, but then starts having ripple effects over time. How do we start over? And this is not about a small fix in different pieces. So what is the way forward through what will be not just transformative change that's being proposed, but there are other old policies on the books that still perhaps need to be revisited. So the question here is, how do we go about doing that?
How do you do big change? Well, the biggest change in recent years affecting social policy in this country was enactment of the Affordable Care Act. I mean, that's a big, complex piece of legislation with a lot of elements. A lot of people spent a lot of years thinking about how it needed to be, because all those pieces, so many pieces of the system had to hang together. But even that, of course, built on the existing structure. I mean, obviously there were folks, and probably a lot of folks in this room, who thought, we should have just thrown out our entire healthcare system and started over. I happen to think that that's at a real risk of doing more harm than good. There are there are dangers to taking everything and throwing it all out. I actually think incrementalism is a little bit undervalued. We can make big changes, big important changes that can greatly improve the lives of tens of millions of people in the country, hundreds of thousands of people here in Hawaii, by building on what we know, by building our institutions and pushing hard. But what it takes is constancy, it takes coalitions, and it takes information. It does take time and hard work. So I appreciate as much as anybody, we get frustrated by the way systems work today. We want to go in and make big changes. I think we also need to value the day-to-day virtues of incremental change.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask a follow-up question on that, Nick, because you have been working with us from afar. You've been here before. The question really is, have you noticed? Is there anything different about Hawaii in terms of our budget creation, our sort of tax creation? What is unique and what is similar?
Well, and we could get into the sort of the details of the GET. I mean, the consumption tax, the GET, is much more broad-based than most other sales taxes around the country. Most states have a sales tax, but it's typically a tax that's only levied on goods, not on services. Hawaii has potentially the opposite problem, which is that it's very broad. It's a very big, broad base, and it has exactly the effect that Victor put up, which is that because it's essentially a tax on all consumption, then folks who are struggling to make ends meet, who are basically spending all of their income or spending all of their income and then some, end up effectively paying the majority of the tax. So that's one way in which Hawaii is a bit of an outlier, and the EITC that was just passed helps to offset that. At a more sort of process or level, more about how policy gets made, one of the things I've been struck by here has been the spirit of collaboration that seems to be coming through. I mean, we had a remarkable meeting at the state legislature yesterday with a group of legislators who seemed really interested in this idea of working together. And that's one of the great things I think about establishing this new center in this environment is the potential to create the conversations that need to happen to move policy forward in a way that gets beyond some of the ideological divisions that honestly in a lot of states and certainly in Washington right now are hampering us from making real progress. So I'm hopeful about that, and if that collaboration actually happens as much as we've talked about it over the last couple of days, it'll be terrific.
So I'm going to continue, and this is for both of you, and that is, how do we shift that narrative? Because the ideologies can be very ingrained, particularly around taxes and what is believed to be fair. And so the question was about the Kansas story is an interesting story, but it's about getting a broader understanding then of tax fairness. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it isn't easy. I mean, it isn't easy to change these fundamental ideas. Let's just recognize that there has been for 40 years a concerted effort by the right to drive home this myth that lower taxes, particularly lower taxes on income, particularly lower taxes for the wealthy, will trickle down and drive prosperity for everyone. Again, this is a case where facts kind of matter, because the fact is that when federal taxes went up in the Clinton administration, we got, and I'm not saying this in a partisan way, but in the 1990s, when taxes went up, we got better economic growth in the 90s than when taxes were cut in the early 2000s. States like Kansas and Wisconsin have grown more slowly than some of their neighboring states like Minnesota or California that have actually raised taxes. And the sort of empirical research backs it up. And then combining those facts with lived experience. I mean, what worked in Kansas was that they went around talking to Rotary clubs and parent-teacher associations, forums and libraries, and saying, what's going on in your community? And they're saying, well, our school budget's getting cut, our school year is shorter, teachers aren't getting pay raises, it's undermining our ability to implement reforms that we know will work. And then you connect, and then the question was, how do you connect the dots for folks to say, okay, do you know why that is? That's because the state budget doesn't have enough money, because we cut taxes so much. And then from there, you create a movement to create change.
Great. I'll continue on this theme, and I'll also ask Gavin about this, because the questions keep coming up around this issue of facts and facts mattering, and how do we keep true to that. And now in this environment of, it's less false news, and it's more social media, viral dissemination of sometimes incorrect facts. So one, how's the center and other policy centers thought about that? And also just, what are you all thinking, Gavin, as well? Because how do we leverage this in a good way?
I think one of the strengths of these SPP centers is they're very nimble, able to respond very quickly. That's always been a strength of Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. So as soon as you can get the correct information out there, the better. You know, and then the other really important part is just having the infrastructure for it, the capacity for it. I mean, actually being able to proactively put out correct information to drown out the stuff that isn't right.
Right. I would add, it is literally an investment. I mean, you just have to make the investment in communications, and I'm sure folks in the room have seen this in any number of areas. It just takes time and effort to counteract the stuff out there that's not accurate with accurate information. Getting out there first, as you said, is really key. Getting out there, adapting to our new social media environment with the kinds of hard-hitting graphics that can grab a reader immediately. Those can be so valuable. I mean, I think in this environment, the idea that a picture is worth 1,000 words may be more true today than ever before. And nimbleness is very critical.
And one other thing, just about the benefits of being part of this partnership is that the partnership has a very sophisticated, they have put a lot of resources into this and into research on how to do exactly this, get the facts out there, make sure that people pay attention. Psychological stuff about how when you're trying to refute a falsehood, you really don't want to repeat the falsehood. So just having access to those types of resources will be really helpful for us.
Nick, and thank you for recognizing the many things that actually Hawaii leads on in this country, particularly in policy and policy for children and families. How do we leverage that? And how do we leverage that in this environment where we are, trying to fully cover children, trying to fully cover people, made this commitment to renewable energy? In this environment, how does Hawaii help lead, not just here in Hawaii?
It's a great question. I think that too has a lot to do with communications. You do have great stories to tell, and thinking about a national audience for those stories, not just a state level audience, is really important. I think there's a hunger now that there wasn't a year ago for state level stories of success like this. With all the dysfunction or worse in Washington, I mean, really, people are coming to me over and over again and saying, states are where it's happening. States are so important. And certainly policymakers, in an ironic way, a year ago, it was if you said, we in state X are going to do things very different from the way they're doing things in Washington, it might have had a different connotation. Today, if you say, we're going to do things differently than they're doing it in Washington, it can have an avowedly sort of pro-opportunity, pro-equality component to it. I think it's important that folks who are working at the state level are kind of doing their work with a little bit of an eye towards how is the work that we're doing charting a course, not just for our community, but also for our state, and not just for our state, but for our nation. And then we do have to figure out what are the venues to tell that story. And there's no doubt about it, like the isolation is a barrier. The physical distance is a barrier. It does strike me that in this day and age, with physical distances shrunk by technology, that should be less of a barrier than ever before.
Right. How, because the partnership then of the State Policy Project and the national network, how have you used and leveraged these state examples. And can you
Right.
give us a few where really it had made a difference to bring these state examples to the fore?
Right, so I just did it, right?
Yep.
Kansas, I talked about Kansas.
Kansas.
And I'm hoping that, that folks here are learning and thinking about the lessons from Kansas, and we've dug into that more. You know, the interesting thing about the Kansas story, of course, is that didn't come out of nowhere. The folks in Kansas that led that effort were drawing on lessons learned in other states, in Georgia and in North Carolina and in Oklahoma, about how do you pull out of the community the information and the stories and the power that you need to move change. So it's a you know, it's really a learning effort, and I'm sure a lot of the folks in this room participate in, perhaps lead networks themselves. You know, maybe you're part of a national network, or maybe you're part of a statewide network. I mean, you know how critical peer-to-peer learning is, and you also know it kind of doesn't happen by itself. So we invest a lot in making sure that those learnings happen, facilitating them. You know, webinars and social media and you know, and occasional convenings. But honestly, you know, again, in this day and age, you don't have to get people together physically to learn.
Great. Gavin, I'm going to ask you the last question. You talked about how the center will be a resource for this community. My question actually is pointed towards them also, of like, what do you need from folks in this room? And what will help the center both get established, grow, and have influence from the folks here?
Yeah, I mean, it's really important. You know, I probably spend a little too much time in my office. It's really important to hear about what's going on out in the world, what's going on with the clients that you're serving, the people that are coming through your doors. I think that is absolutely critical. And so that's the entry. On the other side, once the issues are defined, issues that people can all come together on, that there's alignment on. I wanted to mention about your earlier question about like bipartisanship and working together. I mean, the earned income tax credit is a great example. That is a policy that you know, both the right and the left support. It encourages work. It brings people out of poverty. And so, you know, working together to find an alignment of those interests, and then once we find that, taking the time out of your busy days and the very important work that you are doing day to day to step back and invest a little bit in trying to change those systems that really have an impact and could make a dramatic difference on where we are in the future.
Great. We will post the materials from the conference online. That was another question. We have these others that we'll respond to. I want to thank all three of our speakers this morning and have you thank them as well.
Thank you, sir. Very good.